right. So I'm gonna get us started. A few people might be joining us and coming in, but just to review the agenda for today. So I'm Caitlin. I'll give a little more introduction in a moment, but I'm a member of the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative. And so thanks for joining us today for this monthly session. The topic today is fair trade learning for intentional gap year education. And so our idea for our hour together today is to do some introductions of the facilitators, as well as a couple of polls to get to know all of you. We'll give you an overview of the Gap Year Association, the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative, as well as the Fair Trade Learning Framework. Then we'll spend most of our time together having some breakout room discussions where we apply these concepts of the fair trade learning to ethical partnership building in like real life examples. And then we will also talk about how you can continue to engage with fair trade learning in the future. So first, we'll just do some introductions. Before we go to the attendee introductions, we'll just do some introductions of the facilitators for today. So I can start by giving a little introduction of myself. So as I said, my name is Caitlin. I'm actually in Boston. So it is like 65 today. And I work at the University of Massachusetts, Boston in the Honors College. I'm currently teaching a first-year seminar on global citizenship and social action. I've been involved with different aspects of community-based global learning, international volunteerism, and working with host communities for many years. A lot in South America. I lived in Colombia for 5 years before I moved here to start to work at UMass Boston. And so I'll hand this over to avoid the Zoom awkwardness, I'll hand this over to Ethan, then Elizabeth, Eric, and then Nora for introductions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Yeah, my name is Ethan Knight. I'm here in Portland, Oregon. It's a blue sky day, which is rare. I'll be a little bit yah-yahs out in the field when we're done with this session. Otherwise, I got into the gap year work a long time ago. I'd been doing this work for about 22 years. I like to joke that I'm like the hair club for men guy for gap years. I got to benefit from one and then got to go on and work for the association that's really largely quarterbacking them. A large part of our work is in the standards and accreditation arena, and that's what's brought us to the intersection of the professional development that the CBGL is doing. So I'll pass it forward from there and say thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Bezark, and I'm calling in from Sacramento, California. Like I said, it's about 45 degrees outside, which is California freezing for me. I work with the Gap Year Association on all things accreditation, from accreditation application reviews to updating our standards. And my deep passions are in fostering intercultural learning in order to create a deeper sense of shared humanity across cultures. And I'm equally dedicated to assisting global education and gap year education organizations to improve the reciprocity behind their global partnerships. So I'm grateful to partner with the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative for their Fair Trade Learning Rubric and to create some ways for organizations to get more deeply involved with the standards. And we'll talk more about those opportunities at the end of the webinar, but for now, thank you all for being here.
Hi, everyone. I think we're doing weather. So see that? That's the sun coming into my attic office. It is like a scorcher in Pennsylvania today. That's great. And I'm going to have to figure out how to make my place I've been banished during the pandemic work now that we get sun back into our lives. But I'm Eric Hartman. I work at Haverford College, right outside of Philadelphia. I've worked at a lot of organizations and institutions, always looking at this critical question around campus community partnerships, and also when young people go volunteering places, how do we really increase the likelihood, I hope, of deep, moving, important learning and ensuring that the host communities involved are, definitely not being hurt and potentially even benefiting from the exchange and shared learning opportunities. So that's really been what I've been involved with. I have a book called Community-Based Global Learning, Theory and Practice of Ethical Education at Home and Abroad, and have been a co-founder of the collaborative, which we'll talk more about later, but I would just think of it as like a place where I have the incredible opportunity to learn from so many different contexts, communities, and partnerships, where people who want to keep struggling with those questions repeatedly come together to improve upon practice.
Thanks, Eric, and good afternoon, everyone, or afternoon from Philly. I'm Nora. I'm based in Philly, close to Haverford, and where Eric is. So similarly, it's like almost 70 degrees here today and sunny. I am with the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative. I come to this work, I think, primarily from years of experience running a small nonprofit in rural Nicaragua focused on water and sanitation access. And through that work, hosted hundreds of university students and faculty, mostly in engineering, over the years. So serving in that kind of host community partner role to some extent. And it really now kind of have come back here where I'm focusing on the partnership piece of how do we understand ethical partnerships, how can universities and organizations work together to work towards more just, inclusive, sustainable communities. And through my work with the collaborative, which is now going on 9 years, I think, Eric, we've engaged kind of continually with fair trade learning as one of those tools to help us question, continually learn, and continually work to improve our work in pursuit of those ethical partnerships. So excited to be here. I was excited when Elizabeth reached out and then had an opportunity to work with Elizabeth and Ethan to think more about how we can learn together to continually improve this work that we're all engaged in. So thank you for welcoming us here today.
All right, thanks everyone. So those are our facilitators for today, and we want to get to know our participants through just a couple of polls. So if you're familiar with this website, you go to menti.com, like you can go on your cell phone, just open up a browser. You can open up a new browser link to do it too. And then you enter the code. There'll be a little box and you enter the code. So the first one is, where are you currently located? Oh, good, it's working. The state or the country or wherever you're currently located. So we've got Pennsylvania, Oregon, Boston, Mexico City, New Zealand, The Hague, Netherlands. Cool. Several different countries, several different parts of the US also, California. Awesome, well, welcome. It's great that we'll have all these different points of view here when we break into our rooms. New York City also. And so you can click to go to like the next poll and then enter a new code. And we're looking to know, like, what's your role? So if one of these describes you, you can click it, like, are you working as a nonprofit staff member, university staff, student, gap year program staff, gap year consultant, or other if we didn't quite get your role in there. Also, if it's not working for you, the poll, you could also just type in the chat if you want to participate that way too. So it looks like we have people from all different roles: nonprofit staff, university staff, gap year program staff, consultants, and then other. So we didn't quite get your role in there. If you put other and you want to like type in the chat like what you would say your role is, you can kind of get an idea there. This will also be great for our small group discussions to have different perspectives of different stakeholders. And then the last question to kind of get to know who's here is, oh, something happened here. So the question is, how many students did you work with last year pre-pandemic? So that was only last year. You know, it feels like 1,000 years ago, but how many students did you work with pre-pandemic? And so we have people who like said their role was other. They work in K-12 service learning coordinator, service learning and decolonization consultant, building an immersive service learning abroad program in Italy. Cool. So pre-pandemic, most people were working in this like 0 to 50 range, but we have people working with even more than 200 students per year. So, great, thanks. It's great to get to know the group just a little bit in this virtual way. I'm gonna bring our PowerPoint back up and hand it over for you all to learn a little bit more about the Gap Year Association.
Brilliant, thanks, Caitlin. And kind of fun to see Menti spit that out in the visual way that it does. Yeah, so like I said earlier, my name is Ethan Knight. I'm the Executive Director and founder of the Gap Year Association. Our work intersects in a lot of different areas, but I'll say that sort of there's 4 core pillars of our work. Those 4 core pillars really are sort of mostly sort of aligned with what are the key barriers to entry to joining a gap year, for a gap year student to joining. And so one of them is around research. We have a lot of research efforts that are ongoing, everything from an annual state of the field survey to a once every 5-year larger alumni survey. We just completed that in 2020. And then on our board is Bob Claggett, who runs the Gap Year Research Consortium at Colorado College, whose really sort of chief task is around building some longitudinal data around gap year outcomes. So research is important. Resources, that's to make the gap year more accessible to more people. Fundamentally, it turns out that the vast majority of people, I think, who are not considering a gap year just don't know about it still, which to me, of course, in my own little bubble is just sort of obscene. But that's why the work that we're all in is about opening the bubbles of everyone else that's out there, showcasing sort of a broader way to do this thing called life. 3 is around equity and access. So a large part of our work is indeed making this more accessible to more youth from all backgrounds. And so we work to cultivate financial aid web pages to support scholarships for youth. And ultimately our goal is to gain access to Title IV federal financial aid dollars, FAFSA. That's Pell, student loans, all of those kinds of great funding vehicles for youth to be able to do the gap year. And then last but not least of the 4 pillars is data standards and accreditation. And so being an accredited organization through GYA, we are what's known as a standards development organization, similar to how the Forum on Education Abroad is an SDO, Standards Development Organization for International Education. We are the SDO for gap year education. Organizations that pursue accreditation by us take an average of 8 months, sometimes as long as 2 or 3 years to achieve accreditation. It's a 65-page application document. It's done with a lot of integrity and seriousness, but primarily the lenses are around security, safety. Not surprisingly, that's one of the biggest issues for families. And so our own accreditation standards, as you see on the slide here, they really fall into 5 main certification categories. And so 1, every organization has to do philosophy and professional ethics. That's about safety, that's about sort of pedagogy, that's about experiential education. Every gap year at its core is experientially rooted. And so we have to sort of, not surprisingly, the bulk of all of the standards fit into that philosophy and professional ethics category. Next is fair trade learning. And obviously that's where we intersect the most with the CBGL. But really fundamentally what it comes down to for us is, as we were deciding our own curricula and our own processes and standards for this stuff, our first draft of the standards, we designed our own fair trade learning standards. And quickly it became apparent that there's a lot of other organizations that are competing. And my fear in sort of having each organization have their own sets of standards is that the good becomes radically reduced because it's spread out a lot more. And so that was a large part of the reason why we cultivated a relationship with and really embraced the fair trade learning standards, ideally with the vision that if we can more collectively back one set of standards so that the learning and the lessons aren't on the back of the locals. We've already learned those lessons internally, and they continue to have to learn that every time they host a new group. That's not really where the best use of our resources or sort of our desires, our mission orientation can be found. And so that's why we've really backed the fair trade learning standards and are eager to go as far as we can together with this mission. Backcountry, developing country, that's our third round. That's for sort of if you're, I like to think about if you're 2 to 3 hours away from definitive medical care. And to me, that means that at 2 a.m. you can get a surgeon to provide, to sort of practice an appendectomy, actual surgery. So your local clinic in the backcountry, that's not going to suffice. It's just not sort of the degree of quality that's there. For independent student placements, increasingly students are doing internships and things where they might not have a supervisor there or see them there for 3 weeks or so at a stretch. And those are great gap year opportunities for the right student. And so we have a whole set of substandards for that. And then partnerships, of course, fundamentally, if you're with a homestay, if you're outsourcing an activity or transportation, at the end of the day, the fundamental presumption here is that as a gap year provider, you can never fully outsource student safety or learning. That always is something that you have to relate to. And so even if you're not the expert, that's to say that you've sort of taken the time to do your research and understand it all. Aside from that, I will say GYA, it's a nonprofit membership association. We sort of do double duty as a professional association and a membership association, but we are a 501c3 public benefit. And then the last thing that I'll say in my few minutes here is to highlight that inevitably the bulk of the work that happens for our committees or for our association is done in committees, right? We lean on our membership to do the best parts of the work that we can sort of, offer. And those committees are growing rapidly, and sort of those in real short order so that you can know a possible way to intersect with the GYA if that's something that you haven't done yet. Those are standards and accreditation, diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, higher education, alumni, we have a group for alum, a research committee, an outreach committee that's largely tasked with our every February, we have Gap Year Exploration Month, a sustainability committee. Not surprisingly, we produce a lot of carbon in our work. And so we felt like we needed to have a much better answer than we have, which is not a very good answer, if one at all right now. And then lastly, our membership, and the newest one, the Fair Trade Learning Committee, which is a great transition on to the next speaker here. Elizabeth, did you want to say anything to round out what I just said there?
Yeah, I'll just add to that we update our standards of accreditation every 3 to 4 years with a standards and accreditation committee that represents our field. So we have risk management professionals, gap year program providers, educational consultants, and select professionals as well.
Nice, great addition. Thanks, Elizabeth. Great. I'll pass the baton to Eric, I think, next.
Thank you very much. And I think, Caitlin, that means we can head to the next slide. Are you the person who has that? Great. Thanks. It's great to be here with everybody today. And I'm going to hit start on my timer to keep myself honest. There's a lot of different ways into both the collaborative and fair trade learning. I'm going to tell one story to kind of ground where a lot of these ethics came from and share a bit about our mission, and also just share appreciation for the way that we've been able to partner with Gap Year. One of the things that really we hope is true about the standards are that they're flexible. They're not so determinative that they can't work across different cultural contexts, yet they have teeth. They're rooted. They allow people to work through tough challenges together. We want something that can work across extraordinary diversity, yet hold us accountable, which is what community of practice can help us do so well. So it's great to be connected with the Gap Year on that front. So On the left side of your screen, you have a picture of, it's a picture within a picture. So the man in the top right of that is Mr. Matthias Brown. He is a community leader in the community around Petersfield, Jamaica. And then the picture is the community, the Association of Clubs, which Mr. Brown's part of, hosting some visitors. And really the women on the left who are standing are teaching the women on the right who are standing how to facilitate a community meeting according to how the Association of Clubs does that work. And I got to know Mr. Brown and the Association of Clubs. I wasn't there at the time, but because in the 80s, when the sugar industry collapsed and there were real serious economic troubles in that region of Jamaica, they got together as a community, and they're a rural inland space. They're not one of these likely candidates for tourism, but they got together and said, you know, we could do a community-based model of tourism. We could have a strategy together for economic development. What would that look like? And they're, as a community, pretty influenced by a lot of solidarity thinking. They're not too far from Cuba. They have great linkages there. And the Cuban ambassador visits the AOC sometimes. So they were thinking in ways that were pretty interesting in terms of resource sharing. And they thought, well, if we can do something where when visitors come, the resources don't go to one home, they don't go to one hostel, they rotate across the community. We have homestays that are consciously collaborative in terms of sharing. And we invest a little bit of each visitor's stay, like 15 to 20% to a community pot. We could probably do something interesting here. That was their vision. I mean, that really came out of Petersfield. And and it's important actually, one piece in the story, so they had that vision. And then they started hosting students from the US, and they did it for a few years and stopped. And Mr. Brown always says they stopped because the students were only interested in the 3 Jamaican S's, sun, sand, and you guessed the last one. I'm still thinking he means surf, and I don't know what the problem is, but in any case, they said they got a lot of folks behaving like spring breakers, typical spring breakers, and they didn't want to share their community and their children's like mentorship and their children's exposure to young adults in a way that would jeopardize their community and the ethics they hold as far as good behavior is concerned. So they stopped doing that. And years later, they partnered with Amazaji, which is a nonprofit organization that's part of the network around the collaborative. I was a staff member at Amazaji later. I don't have a formal relationship with it now, but of course, a lot of good friends there. But in any case, they partnered with Amazaji and had a great advocate within saying just repeatedly that they weren't going to do it if they didn't get the principles of community-driven economic transparency and the kinds of intentionality that I was sharing at the outset woven through everything. And their clarity on those commitments was so important in that partnership. It really was inspiring. And we started to write a little bit about it. And then we connected with other folks who were thinking seriously about this. And Rich Slimbach at Azusa Pacific in Southern California in particular had really started working through some principles. And we started to put those things together and say, hey, here's what we've learned from the AOC in Petersfield, and here are some principles that Rich has been working with. And then we shared them with colleagues in Uganda, Bolivia at conferences, and we got a lot of feedback. And that was kind of the genesis for a set of principles that consider things like, is there an intentional community theory of change? What about your marketing? Marketing, like marketing is your first educative touch, right? So when you market, are you informing students about the solidarity work that they're invited to be part of, or are you reinforcing stereotypes? You know, and that's the dichotomy. There are step points in between, and we try to use the standards across a diversity of partnerships to investigate how things are going, hold ourselves accountable. There's also, I described the process of emergence, and then there's also a couple of critical points that were added a few years ago in the process because of all of the research that came out looking at the ways in which unintentional consequences related to high volume international volunteering can create these really horrific, perverse economies around children's homes, orphanages, and the medical volunteering. So a principle was added to really work for clarity on people who are in populations that are vulnerable. So that's the emergence of fair trade learning. And the principles, which we're going to look at some examples here in a few moments and get into more detail with the principles. But I started with that story first rather than the collaborative because fair trade learning has been such a important, Laura's on the call here and could even unmute and pop in for this because I can't remember the terminology. Within communities of practice, there are, what is it?
Artifacts.
Artifacts, right? They're artifacts that are created by, bring people together, they become a kind of unifying piece. And fair trade learning has been that. Different colleges use it to examine their partnerships, different organizations. It's really not about fundamentals so much as it is about queries to do checks around things that have repeatedly shown up as difficult and challenging across around the world with a lot of feedback. So it's been an important document for the collaborative. The collaborative itself is a network of educational institutions, individuals, and community organizations that advance ethical, critical, and aspirationally decolonial. That's a really important aspirationally. We realize we don't necessarily know where we're headed, but we think it's important to decolonize this work because we want to do relationships toward more just, inclusive, and sustainable communities, which is the other thing about our mission that's so important. It's not about process, which so many educational institutions really keep their sights on. It is about outcomes. Are we working together to co-create more just, inclusive, sustainable communities? So that's where we work to ground ourselves. And I look forward to brainstorming with you all today.
Thanks, Eric. Did you want to talk through the principles of the Fair Trade Learning Rubric?
All right.
I can do it, yeah.
I mean, it's up to you. I thought I was doing the big picture overview.
Okay, great. Sure, I'll take it from here. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, so what we're going to focus on today is introducing you to the Gap Year Association's adaptation of the Fair Trade Learning Rubric Principles. So we're just going to go over these briefly, and then we will delve into 3 of these principles in small groups so that you can look at them a little bit more closely. So the Gap Year Association has made some slight adjustments to the original Fair Trade Learning Rubric, which we have linked in a document that I'm going to send to you if you want to look at the kind of the origins of the rubric. And so there are 13 principles that the Gap Year Association is using. They include common purposes for partnership, host community program leadership, rights of the most vulnerable, host community program participation, community theory of change, ethics in recruitment and publications, communication, orientation to place and experience, local sourcing and environmental impact, economic considerations and impact, clarity of commitment and evaluation of partnership success, financial transparency, and congruence of staff. So that gives you the big overview of the principles, and we're going to dive deeper into 3 of the principles today: common purposes for partnership, host community program leadership, and rights of the most vulnerable. So I'm going to put in the chat here a document that I will also share my screen to share with all of you. So I put a Google Doc in the chat, and I'm going to share it on my screen here. So here you'll see an overview of these 3 principles that we're going to be looking at today, as well as a definition. These are a work in progress. They are going to be finalized soon for the Gap Year Association's standards and accreditation process. If you want to read more about the original fair trade rubric and background on fair trade learning, there's a link there to some information. And so what you're going to do today, when we put you into your breakout rooms, you'll have about 10 minutes in your breakout rooms. And the discussion prompt that we want you to think about is to think about a global volunteer service learning partnership that you know about. So you could be directly involved, or it could be something you've heard or read about. And then how does the fair trade learning rubric principle that your group will be talking about relate to that partnership? So you can talk about what are examples of positive or negative application of the principle, or you could also talk about how you could apply this principle and plan and run a future program. So we'll have 4 breakout rooms. There'll be, oh, our numbers keep changing. I'm gonna do 3 breakout rooms. And so breakout room 1, 2, and 3 will focus on each of these principles listed here. So you can read in more detail in your small groups about the principle and then discuss. So I'm going to put us into 3 breakout rooms. And so just note the breakout room when it pops up on your screen so that you know which principle you're going to be talking about. And any questions before I put you into breakout rooms, feel free to chat or unmute.
One thing, Caitlin, if I can just offer real quickly, just to sort of like highlight how the adaptability of the standards work, because I think that that's really important. Both in Gap Year world, we're working with programs that are on a seafaring vessel for the entire time, as well as domestic programs. And in the same vein, sort of our standards have to apply to that sort of entire gamut of experiences. So too does the collaboratives, the fair trade learning standards have to apply to a variety of different experiences as well. And so the Forum on Education Abroad recently went through their own adaptation of this to their audiences. And I think that to me speaks to the power and integrity of this, the fair trade learning rubric in general. And as we're sort of diving into the details, inevitably finding new avenues, new corners to turn around. And, you know, like Eric's talking about, you know, domestic operations, absolutely, these things should largely still apply. So.
Thanks, Ethan.
Yeah.
All right, there you go. The rooms are open. You can join them. Oh, it's probably, are people getting the room notification on their screen?
I mean, Caitlin, there's few enough, and you know, time is passing quickly. We could just sort of dive into 1 or 2 ourselves, just tightly. If that works.
A couple people went into the room, so I'm not quite sure.
Oh.
I just went in and I was the only one.
Yeah, I didn't see an option to pop into one, actually.
I didn't see one either.
Yeah.
Okay, the rooms are all open, but well, yeah, I have a message that says all participants have been invited to join a breakout room.
You know, Caitlin, we're a pretty small group at this point. Maybe we could just
Yeah.
have a discussion all together.
Yeah.
We can do that, yeah. Okay. So let me bring back up the document with the with the definitions so that we can take a look at those. Yeah. And I mean, we can dive into maybe the first principle, or I mean, we can also take thoughts or questions about the fair trade learning framework in general, if that makes sense too. So here, let's take a look at the first principle just for a few moments and get some thoughts and feedback, just so you can kind of understand what these look like, as opposed to like just, you know, titles sort of. So the common purposes for partnership. So the idea behind that is that provider and community partners have shared understandings of the partnership's mutual goals and aspirations. Such goals could include learning outcomes for all stakeholders, community improvement goals, financial goals, etc. So relevant stakeholders understand mutual commitments to setting and implementing their goals for the partnership. Stakeholders also understand the duration of the partnership itself and the duration of the individual programs and/or projects. Ideally, mutual conception of the purposes of the partnership extends beyond merely transactional.
I can't see everybody at once, but if it makes sense, I could drop in an example here from Philadelphia area, since that sort of domestic questions seem to come up as somebody's dropping off. So one thing that seems fair to say about a lot of volunteering, service learning, maybe several years ago, maybe still today, is often it's sort of like, where can I place my students? Where can they get an experience, right? And then, I mean, we all, probably most of us have been in that moment. And, you know, it can lead to a logistical, where do they go? Who needs them? What this calls out is, you know, every nonprofit has a theory of change. Every nonprofit has a vision of the future. Every nonprofit has profound, deep insights. I'm thinking about nonprofits as partners right now. Again, partners can be anybody, but so here in Philadelphia, Haverford's just outside the city. We partner with a lot of organizations in the city. One organization is called Puentes de Salud, which is Bridges to Health and does a lot of health with migrant populations. Puentes makes it easy because they're a really smart nonprofit organization. They have a two-part mission. The first part is about meeting immediate needs, and the second part is about educating future generations of healthcare providers and physicians about structural injustice and structural determinants of health. So they say it right in their mission. But any smart nonprofit is always invested in the education of the up and coming generation, right? Because nonprofits tend to address issues that tend to have structural determinants, right? So in what ways are the students and the partnerships being invited in, not to a one and done, you got your hours, reflect, go home, but what is it about our mission that we're trying to impart to you, and how does that overlap with the college or university mission in the partnership that I'm part of? Again, in this case, they made it really simple because we're a college that's interested in people understanding structural determinants and et cetera. But sometimes seeking that mutuality of learning goals, or in other cases, perhaps there's a very systematic, we do just want hours. We want students to complete X, Y, or Z, but how's that tie back to our shared theory of change and desires?
I've got a story to tell similarly, where we thought we were going in. This was 10 years ago in rural India, and we had a cohort of youth students who were going to go in for a short-term 2-week project. And after contacting who we thought were the right stakeholders, the right local leadership to direct us to sort of a project that was community sourced, we went in and built some latrines for a community that didn't have latrines. They were sort of by and large using the local stream for bathing, as well as for latrines, for cooking, all of those things. And so we decided we'd go in and sort of follow their lead and build a latrine. 2 weeks of solid work. Students really had a sense of accomplishment. They did something. We were navigating into the realm of development instead of education, which is a scary place to be for most of us, but we thought we were in the right to do it with all of the right contacts and conversations. Students left and we came back a semester later, and we're going to do another project in that community. It turns out that the panchayat, the village chief, the guy who was in charge of who had the most say in that community, had effectively padlocked the latrine and turned it into a personal storage. And so all of our students were coming in and saying, hey, there's a common purpose. We both know that there's needs for latrines. So we did that. We talked to the right leadership. We both know that there's sort of the right person in charge. And yet, sort of despite all of our best intentions, we created more white water in that community than sort of had been there when we first went. And so it was a sort of a bell toll to the brain for all of us to say, we thought we were doing this right. We thought we went in with the right intentions. And what ended up happening was we created more of a muck for the local community. Yeah, they had a structure, but they could have built that structure. They didn't need a bunch of people to fly around the globe and do that for them. So again, it went back to, it sort of created this existential sort of deep questioning. We've never gone to work back in that community again for fear of doing it right. And so I think we both walked away at a loss because we didn't have better rubrics, better structures, better ways to think about how we might incorporate the right people into the larger project. And one of the questions I always come back to at the end of something like that is what are the specific lessons, the specific takeaways, right? What could I have done better in this instance? And then the next question is, what are the universal takeaways? Are there things that I can sort of abstract to across a variety of different circumstances? And I have to say, sort of, this rubric is as close to I've come on the universal front, but the specifics, there was a lot of specific lessons that we dove into, and we probably could have done twice as much as we did.
Well, kind of building off that, then I guess I have a question. As we're building our program right now, and we're going to be putting together a service learning program in rural Italy, and I want to avoid some of those pitfalls, right? So what advice would anyone have, I guess, as we get going with this? I know that our starting point is going to be a community needs assessment that we're going to work up with our kind of Italian business partners. And the idea is to talk with government leaders and local businesses and residents and so forth, and kind of figure out what needs they may have, because obviously we don't want to come in and do the one and done. We want to make sure that we can set up some long-lasting partnerships and projects. So I don't know, beyond that, any advice that anyone would have? And of course, I'm interested to read and learn about the fair trade learning objectives, and we'll work off of those as well. But
good question, Scott. Glad to see that you're thinking about it now rather than on the tail end.
Yeah, I have more of a rural development kind of experience with the Peace Corps. And I learned, just like Ethan, so many times when we were going to do Lorena clay stoves, and they ended up being chicken coops instead. But I think you really, when you're doing a community assessment, you've got to talk to the people, not necessarily the government officials, not necessarily the highfalutin businessmen or women, but it's the people, because they're the ones that have the needs versus what an official or prime minister or whatever might say or want to make them look good. So I really recommend you go to the people, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was gonna also mention one thing, and I'll drop this in, or actually, Nora, if you could share the toolkit Fair Trade Learning page, Scott, that could be a resource. We put together a few things to walk into this kind of frame of thinking, and of course, there's the committee that's going to dive deep into this with GYA. But getting familiar with the frame of thinking. Appreciate the comment, Marianne. I think the fair trade learning approach, if it does anything, it should embrace an awful lot of humility. And that's kind of like, it's coming from this space of working across contexts again and again and again where that wasn't the case. And so how do we do process that that enables us to do things, right? Because the solution that drives me crazy is stay home, right? And pretend the world as it exists is fine. That's not it. How do we walk into this? So with a lot of humility and getting familiar, but using the questions in the rubric and talking with people in a relational way over time. I think one thing I was reflecting, you know, because someone mentioned New York, it made me think of Philadelphia. So I shared the Puente story. And then I was sitting here reflecting on, oh, what's missed by using the Puente story? The nice thing that is added about the Puente story is it makes it explicit, something Nora might have been alluding to with the development education kind of intersection. It makes explicit that often we don't need to do things to be aligned with the appropriate theory of change. So in other words, with the relationships I've had in the Dene Nation, in Navajo Nation in Arizona, other indigenous communities around the world with Puentes de Salud, and in a lot of contexts, what young people from the United States first need to do is recognize how much they need to learn, right? Before they can really start acting. On the one hand, on the other hand, the nice thing about being explicit about theory of change is you can have these really interesting conversations like I've heard in Northern Ireland. Well, we're going to get them to do something together. We don't really care about that thing, but the act of having people who aren't Northern Irish Protestant and Northern Irish Catholic in the same space in a peer community opens up space in a new way. That's what we're really after. We're after them doing a project as a sneak attack on creating community. And it's those kinds of conversations that are so important to have in a relational kind of way. And finally, the theory of change makes explicit, like, we're going to try this for 3 months, and then we're going to reassess, right? And building in these sort of like, we're not partners because we say we're partners. We're iterative, and we have to be really conscious of this. We continue to learn from this, so much. It's got a bit of genesis and history behind it, but it continues to grow, and I'm looking forward to catching up with the exciting reframings coming through.
Well, and the only thing I would add there, because clearly that's a big question about, starting a program, but thinking of fair trade learning, I think we think of it as a set of queries and questions too, to spark and catalyze dialogue between multiple stakeholders who are thinking about collaborating, right? So it's not that I'm going to just look at these and decide how they hash out in a partnership or a potential immersion experience. It's that we're going to say this, let's sit down and talk about this question together. What if all the stakeholders who we're partnering with are looking at our recruitment and publication materials? Do we have different perspectives on whether or not they're educating in the way that we think is ethical? Are we all comfortable with those recruitment and publication materials? And sparking that dialogue, that space to talk together about that. And Marian referenced like the different folks that might be involved, not just one representative. One representative never represents anything, right? So how do we think about ways of ensuring participation from multiple stakeholder groups and multiple representatives within each of those groups to ask some of these questions and talk about them together? So thinking about it also not as just some definitive answer, but as a way to say, oh, I wasn't really thinking to ask them about that, but maybe we should talk about that so it doesn't slip between the cracks. Just that dialogue space in and of itself can be such a collaborative planning space to hopefully work towards a mutually beneficial collaboration.
And to be clear, the rubric as it's written, it does break out what's entry level and sort of tries to guide you towards sort of what we would consider a more advanced way to ponder, think about, query the sort of the issues that are at the fore. The Jamaican example that was really the foundation of this entire vision. Like one of the things that I love about that, and I keep coming back to it, is this idea that it's a community-run community. Right? Like they are their own ambassadors. We can go to them and we have a clear chain of conversation versus who's the representative? Who do I census? Because that's an impossible question, especially from an outside perspective. You've got to have longevity in the space. Otherwise, you don't have the respect to even sort of ask the questions in many cases.
Yeah.
Art
That's great.
has it.
So I'm going to share like a very concrete resource along these lines of like fostering conversation. So Nora put a link to what is known as the toolkit. And there is a applying fair trade learning page where you can find a link to the original rubric, as well as this set of queries. So this might be something that is useful as you're planning a new program to kind of guide. So I wanted to point out that resource. I think I see one question. So why don't we take this one question and then we will move into just telling you a few ways that you can continue to engage with fair trade learning. Eric, I cut you off. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Oh, I'm sorry, just that Bart has a hand up.
Okay, yeah. Go ahead, Bart.
Oh, well, thank you. Greetings from Holland. I'm the one from The Hague in Holland. I think I'm a little bit of an outlier here too, because I'm also the one who works with K through 12 students at an American international school overseas, the American School of The Hague. And so the students that I work with are typically younger. Now, we've just redone our mission statement at school, and it reads something like, we create a better world as we become better people, and the world is our classroom. So what we are really interested in is this whole idea of fair trade learning to provide a structure for our relations with partners that we already have in countries like Nepal and in Thailand and so on. And based on the conversations I heard today, and that's why I preceded this by saying I'm K through 12. So maybe this is, I don't know if this is a benefit to anybody else. But as great as the rubrics are, they're a little bit too wordy for some of the students that I work with. And I'm involved in a lot of educational initiatives. And one of the initiatives I'm involved in, the idea that we're developing there, and this is about future-friendly schools, I'd call it, I suppose. One of the initiatives or formats we're thinking of there is to create a pledge. And this is where I love the simplicity of the slide that you had, Caitlin, with the 13 standards or principles. And if, as an organization, for us, it would be the American School of The Hague, but also gap year organizations and so on, together with the partners, whether it be Jamaica or whatever, would have like a very simple kind of like a one-page pledge that we will find common purpose and always have conversations about that. We will protect the most vulnerable and so on. I'm wondering if that is also like something to create, because it will be the excuse to have those difficult conversations from both sides whenever that might occur. So that was just a thought.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And, you know, we do have a pledge with the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative that echoes a lot of the fair trade learning ethos. And so I do think that that does start conversations, for example, about working with vulnerable populations. If your organization, you know, currently does engage with vulnerable populations, like to be able to bring that up. If we want to sign this pledge and be a part of this group and this commitment, you know, what does this mean? So I think that's an excellent example. And Eric said that Elon University is doing that also. So
I'm just going to pop in and also say I love the idea. I feel so guilty. I saw that slide. Caitlin, thanks for working through it. I thought that really needs an editor. Of course, I probably wrote the text that was there, but in any case, we can improve this with communication for sure.
Great, thanks for the question. Thanks for the suggestion too. Yeah, great. So we're gonna move on here. This is a very quick introduction to fair trade learning. You do have that Google Doc where you can go to the webpage and learn a little bit more. And we're going to share some ways that you can continue to learn and become engaged with fair trade learning through GYA and through the collaborative. So Elizabeth, do you want to talk about the new committee?
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. So Caitlin and I will be starting a new committee for the Gap Year Association around fair trade learning. And the mission of the committee will be for to create ways for organizations to improve the reciprocity and ethics in their global, which includes local and domestic, partnerships in service learning and community-based learning through fair trade learning principles. There will be a quiz on how fast you can say that 5 times. So first meeting. And a few of the goals that we have in mind, which are absolutely flexible and open for collaboration and co-creation. We want to build the table that we're coming to together. A few ideas that we have so far are to build pedagogical resources around each of the principles. And we have a timeline for how long that'll take. We're not going to try and get it done in one meeting. And also we're going to have some possible areas for research for you to be involved in through this committee as well. I'll pop into the chat the time for the first meeting, which will be March 30. March 32nd is apparently a date now, March 22nd at 12 p.m. PST. And we'll go over more details about the goals and projects and ask for your input as well. We would love to have you involved.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. And one of the areas that we'll be working on is a research project that is actually related to my dissertation on mutually beneficial partnerships in community-based learning or international volunteerism from the perspectives of partner communities. So we'll be developing a survey as well as interviews. So if you and your organization are interested in becoming involved in that, the committee is a great way to become involved. And Eric or Nora, do you want to talk a little bit more about becoming involved with the collaborative?
Yeah, I think the committee that you just shared is one of the best portal entry points right now. And Nora and I are both really accessible if folks have any specific follow-up questions. And we just really appreciate your time and love the bit of interaction we got to have today.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for attending today, for being interested in these principles, and please feel free to reach out, join us. The links that we sent today will also take you to the collaborative webpage. So we hope to continue to be engaged with you.
Thanks, Caitlin. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Nora. Really appreciate getting to do this. Yeah. All right, everyone. We'll appreciate your care for this issue and continuing to sharpen the saw. I look forward to doing it more together.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Talk soon.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.